Hi, and welcome everyone. We're excited to have you all here for our Delta AFA Town Hall on the hidden costs that we face here at Delta without a contract. My name's Tiffany Henninger. I'm a Detroit-based Delta flight attendant, and I've been flying for almost 15 years. I love my job here at Delta, and that's why I and other activists are organizing to build our union here with AFA. Management has typically kept our pay rate on par with the unionized carriers like United and American in an effort to keep us from unionizing. And while compensation may look the same or even a little better at the top of the scale, there are many areas where we do fall behind, such as trip construction, sick pay, healthcare, and many other hidden costs. So let's get to it. First, she needs no introduction. Sarah Nelson, AFA International President, who's been a union flight attendant since 1996. Hi, Sarah. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to kick it over to you to frame this conversation, and then I'll let you and Dan take it away.
Great. Thanks, Tiffany. So let me just start by saying that I have sat at the bargaining table with Dan Akins helping out for nearly 20 years, actually. We've been working on costs of flight attendant contracts and other contracts throughout the industry. And you couldn't have a better expert here on this call than Dan, who has worked actually with every single carrier in the industry, has models that were comparative costs in terms of when we went through all the bankruptcies, when we were trying to stop the cuts from going too deep. And then as we started to bargain to try to make things better through merger negotiations and other negotiations, what really happens at the table is that we get to see exactly how our careers are held back without a contract at Delta, because there are so many costs that Delta is able to avoid, as Dan would call them, the back of the book costs, the things that are isolated, like sick leave, like vacation, like your healthcare. These are items that you can't compare easily. And Delta takes advantage of that, but it's also where they take control and they keep the costs lower. At our last negotiations at United, we had to bargain against the fact that we were bargaining for a contract at United Airlines with essentially the same size of flight attendant ranks and number of hours that we were flying if you compared United and Delta. But the cost for the flight attendant contract that we were trying to achieve and ultimately did was $100 million more a year at United Airlines. And that was very difficult to bargain for those improvements. We know across the industry that if Delta flight attendants were organized, we could lift our industry together. But because without a contract at Delta, we all are subject to the fact that management can say there's no true way that we can compare our costs to Delta, because from one day to the next, management has the ability to change the terms. And so it's even harder when you're comparing against costs that can slip immediately. It was why it was so important. One of the reasons it was so important that we fought so hard for the payroll support program during COVID, because that kept Delta from saying that in this crisis, they needed to cut your costs that then would have created a big sucking sound at the rest of the airlines too, even where we had contracts and where management at least would have to go through negotiations with us. So I'm not going to go on too long at all. Dan is going to get into some of these costs that form a flight attendant contract, that form the things that matter to us and ultimately affect our take-home pay, our ability to plan for our families, our ability to tell a mortgage agent how much we can count on so we know how much we can qualify if we're trying to buy a condo or a house for our families, and what we can plan to count on in our retirement. So I'm going to kick it over to Dan, but I just want you to know that there is no better expert on labor costs in the industry, not just with flight attendants, but with every single work group at every single airline. Thanks, Tiffany, for having me today. I look forward to talking with everybody about the rest of this too.
Thank you. We're excited to have you. So next, we'd like to welcome Dan Akins. As Sarah said, he's an aviation economist with 30 years of experience consulting in the commercial airline industry. Dan's been involved in almost every flight attendant or pilot contract you can think of. He's a graduate of the London School of Economics, where he specialized in transport economics. Hi, Dan. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Tiffany, and thank you both for the kind introduction. One thing I noticed that Sarah and Tiffany both have is a better lighting situation than I do. But anyway, I appreciate everybody being here on this call, and I think it's really important to anyone
just because he's good at economics doesn't mean he's good at theater. Okay, so let's just set that aside.
I'll try and get So I think it's really fairly obvious in terms of when I take a look at what Sarah described and I describe as the back of the book, in that Delta does have a way to essentially deal with its employees who are not organized, who only include obviously two groups that are organized, the dispatchers and the pilots, in a way that convinces Delta flight attendants that they're getting sort of the things that other flight attendants that are unionized get. And what I want to talk to you about is there's an obvious deficiency in the things that Delta has in their handbook compared to what virtually every other carrier of your size or even regional carriers like Endeavor have that are bargained for, because the flight attendants at those airlines have a voice in what they need and what they want, right? So what I want to walk through is some very sort of obvious reflections on where you are relative to the other flight attendant groups in the industry, how that impacts your contractual priorities and what Delta has in the handbook versus what other carriers have in their bargain for contracts and their policies. And then I want to look at some of the actual real world data that shows that Delta is saving money by working you more and essentially, costing less than what other carriers in the industry have with organized bargain for work rules, benefits, et cetera. And the last part of it is really to look at the PSP portion of the sort of events in 2020 and how that sort of evolved and where you stand relative to other flight attendant groups and carriers in terms of savings that you've provided to your company versus the other larger carriers. So I guess with that, I'd like to just sort of begin talking about kind of the shock value of what I see in the isolated nature of Delta flight attendants being the only large U.S. airline where a majority of employees aren't organized. And obviously, compared to what sort of Southwest has done or other non-union or other unionized carriers, you can be organized and still have low costs and have an airline that functions with a very high degree of pay and good work rules like at United or Delta or American. But what is obvious to me is that being isolated as the only large carrier that isn't organized around its flight attendants with a contract is that you don't get to bargain for wages, benefits, work rules, pay rates, pay protections, time off, all of the things that fill up the 300 to 400 pages of a United contract. You don't have. You've got a changeable, fungible, dynamic handbook that goes through several iterations that they have to send you each year. And that's different than a contract because none of it's predictable. None of it's reliable. As much as they want to talk about it being a replacement for a contract, it certainly isn't to the degree that it changes and is at the employer's whim to determine what you get from day to day. And I want to go through a couple of those examples with you in a minute. I took a look at just a real quick snapshot of the largest carriers that have significant flight attendant populations. And you'll see that of the large carriers, Alaska, American, say Hawaiian, Frontier, everyone else is organized. Everyone else either is bargaining for, has an existing collective bargaining agreement, which is what CBA stands for. Delta doesn't. SkyWest also doesn't, but they're not a large carrier. They're a regional carrier. And that Delta kind of stands alone as a very large flight attendant group at a principally large U.S. major that doesn't have a bargaining agent to voice their issues through their union to collectively bargain for your interests. So this is kind of shocking to me to see that all these carriers are organized and function and are competitive and make money with flight attendant unions. Just like Delta does the same thing with ALPA and their dispatchers, they can have a union there to represent your interests. There's no question in my mind that's part of the parameters Delta has to deal with as an airline. And it stands alone without a flight attendant union amongst virtually every operator in the US, except for SkyWest. So one of the pieces of this that Sarah touched on regarding the bankruptcy legalities is that by not having a collectively bargained contract, the handbook isn't legally binding. Those provisions are considered to be applications of your job by an employer for at-will employees. That is, they can change it depending on whatever circumstances they face, whatever day they wake up and want to change things, they can change it. In bankruptcy, it's very important because you don't even get a voice in the bankruptcy hearings for your interests. They treat you as expendable, and they can change anything they want, and they will. So part of the backside of having a contract is it's legally binding, and that you have grievance procedures. The NMB is there to stand by you, to help promote the legalities of your contract, to make sure it's accurately voted on and reflects the will of the employees. So that's something you don't have in the handbook, is a legally binding guarantee to any of the things that are in the handbook, other than a job that you have to sort of subscribe to that has changing work rules, pay rates, et cetera, on a day-to-day basis. Next slide, please. So one of the things I've heard that is emblematic of this problem is that Delta, on a whim, decided that they would like to have flight attendants on board in this D40 program, which essentially makes you stand on the aircraft, engage with passengers for 5 minutes earlier than the D35 program previously that was in the handbook. So that's just one small example that sort of pops out in my mind that's frustrating, because if this were a unionized contractual relationship, they couldn't do that. That would be subject to bargaining, and they would have to approach the union to see if this is even possible during Section 6, which is the section under the legal code that you bargain under the Railway Labor Act, that they would not be able to change this on a whim. So there's one example that wouldn't happen at United, it wouldn't happen at American, it wouldn't happen at Endeavor, because they'd have to bargain with the flight attendant union to decide whether or not this was permissible during contract negotiations. So one of the things that's obvious to me from what Sarah had reflected on being involved in different carrier negotiations is that Delta waits for other carriers, AFA, to negotiate rates for their flight attendants and then essentially matches them. So they're using other carriers on your behalf to essentially keep the rates the same. And so what I think this does is it essentially puts top line sort of shiny pennies out there for the public to consume and for flight attendants to consume, that we are making as much money or more than other carriers that have unions. And that's the game that Delta's played for a long time now, essentially since the acquisition of Northwest, that they don't acknowledge that high pay rates and bonuses are just there to sort of cover up what's hidden and dramatically inferior in your work rules, scheduling, and pay guarantees, among other things, let alone whether it's a guaranteed work rule or scheduling or pay guarantee. They're not equal to what other flight attendants have in the industry that have unions bargaining for them, like AFA. And I'll give you some examples in the next section. But first, we'll take a look at what I think is that the agreements that Delta has made through the handbook are essentially covered up with inferior provisions with these top line benefits of pay rates and bonuses. So, and we'll see how Delta's done that in terms of pay rates in one of my slides. But that's essentially what every flight attendant at Delta should be aware, that these payments and bonuses are there to sort of, make money for the flight attendants and give you a top shelf sort of income. But the back of the book are the things that cost you in terms of paying more for healthcare, working more for the amount of money you get, and other things in the contract that would normally protect your work rules and pay during a given trip or a day or a month. I think Delta management obviously knows this, and their very visible top line monetary benefits that they tout in the press and to you guys are just slightly above those of other carriers as they try to depress other unions' interests in you guys organizing. They've come out and said, you guys got high pay rates and high bonuses. why in the world would you want a union here? We're providing everything that other unions or organizing efforts would give you. And that's clearly not the case. And I want this document to show that to you very clearly. There's very concrete examples of that. So starting off with the first slide that has some data on it, this slide shows the top of scale pay rates at the largest carriers in the industry going back to 2007. And that includes Alaska, American, United, Southwest, and historical pay at Continental and US Airways as they existed through time. You can see the red line is what Delta was paying top of scale right through and after the acquisition of Northwest Airlines in 2008, slightly below the top line of the average of the other carriers who were all unionized. And you can see in about 2016, that red line kind of goes above the blue line and then falls below it and is sort of having a much tighter relationship with the average of other carriers. And essentially, Delta has done this using other carriers to bargain for those blue rates and then essentially convincing you that you're getting just as much as those other carriers because they're paying you the equivalent amount or close to it since 2007, excuse me.
And I'll just chime in, Dan, that again, this is top of scale because they're expecting everyone to go compare that top line, but
Right.
that may not have been the case throughout the rest of the pay scale either. So anyone
Right.
who's climbing through the pay scale, you should take a close look at that because you may be really losing out because you don't have someone bargaining for you at your seniority level.
Right. And next slide, please, Taylor. One of the biggest obstacles, I think, to a flight attendant working under no contract is the fact that you don't know when Delta is going to decide, whenever they decide on a whim, to give you a pay increase to keep up, to match that red line that we just saw. And I just, every other contract that I've ever worked on, one of the principal features of those contracts and one of the places that flight attendants and pilots and mechanics go is a rate table. And this rate table is just emblematic of what other carriers with unionized employees have in terms of pay rates over time. And on the left-hand side is just an example of the Endeavor contract starting in 2020. And you'll see that those pay rates move from left to right. And also as you move up the scale, just like at Delta, but it's not a snapshot. There's a time definite known increase that will occur on a date, which in the first instance is April 1st of 2021, which has already occurred, and then April 1st of 2022 with another upgrade, as well as the anniversary upgrades that every flight attendant would get upon annual years of service until you're topped out. So what you don't see here at Delta is any fixed, predictable, and visible pay rate increase that you could depend on to finance a car or someone's education or a condo or a house. You don't know when that next increase is going to happen. Whereas, for example, Endeavor, a Delta connection carrier, the wholly owned subsidiary of Delta, they got a 17.8% increase in 2020 over 2019 with this new contract that was just recently negotiated. And in 2021, those rates are going to go up again in 2022, in 2023. So if you're topped out, you know that by the time you get to 2025, you're going to have 27% more income in your pocket as a result of this pay increase than what you had in 2019. Delta flight attendants do not know when that will occur or if it will occur. And so that's one of the issues I think that's fundamentally absent from your handbook is there's no predictable, visible, dependable way to know what you're going to get paid 2 years, 3 years, even 2 months into the future. And that's to the detriment of any flight attendant who's trying to plan finances around their job. And it's unique, again, to Delta flight attendants. Every other flight attendant group except Southwest or SkyWest has a table that looks like this. Next slide, please. So I want to go over pretty quickly some of the contractual provisions that other carriers have and compare it to what's in the Delta handbook. And these are the things that I consider to be in the back of the book. Again, these are the things that may not take the headlines. They're not big bonuses. They don't have billions of dollars attached to them, but they're critically important to flight attendants who work in the same industry as you do. And they've evolved over years and years of contractual bargaining that places an emphasis on the flight attendant's voice in terms of the operation that touches all kinds of things that aren't addressed by big pay rates and bonuses. So the next slide. One of the things I've noticed is the maximum scheduled hours per month is Delta is the only carrier amongst the big carriers, including Endeavor, that does not have a monthly max schedule hours. It's essentially whatever Delta wants to schedule you at. Other carriers bargain hard to keep schedule max down for quality of life, for headcount issues, and other reasons. And you can see that even Southwest, that has some of the loosest work rules in terms of monthly scheduled max, has 113 effective hours per month that they can schedule their flight attendants up to. Delta, in a sense, has infinity. Whatever they determine is necessary for the flight attendant pool and the flying that's out there, they can force you to fly high. And there's no other carrier that's out there that has flight attendants' voices involved in setting this section of their contracts that essentially allow their company to have an unlimited amount of hours potentially scheduled for maximum in any month.
And Dan, let me just jump in here quickly.
Sure.
This also dovetails with what Delta did a couple of years ago in moving from a monthly pay schedule to a biweekly pay schedule. That was all about cranking more and more hours out of you without you really realizing it, and giving more of your productivity with less pay for Delta flight attendants, because you have to work during that time in order to have all of the benefits that you have. Otherwise, you're going to be paying more and more to Delta.
Right, exactly. And each one of these things, maximum monthly hours, affects your lifestyle, your time away from base, all sorts of things that once you schedule high, and you have unlimited amounts of time to give to your company, it affects the other parts of your life, including other parts of your life as a flight attendant, in terms of where you stay, how long you're away, how many hours you have to work for your pay. And this would be one of the things I would imagine AFA would address when they become the bargaining agent for the Delta flight attendants, if you so choose, is having a industry standard maximum scheduled hours for flight attendants to work as a principal item here to control.
That would be very standard, but I'll just make the point that Delta flight attendants will decide what they want to have in their contract. And because this is their union, they will bargain for it. They will be the ones at the table. They'll be running the survey off of what they want. And of course, we'll provide them with all of the information about what industry standard is, but they get to choose that as well.
Sure. And for all of these, it's the Delta flight attendants choosing what they think is needed. Minimum monthly line guarantee hours, the opposite. What's the company commitment? So if you look at how unfair that is to have infinity hours available in a month from each flight attendant, the company also guarantees flight attendants less minimum than other carriers. So on the one side, when they want you to work, they can work as much as they want. On the other side, when you have to get a minimum guarantee, guess what Delta does? There's no flight attendant voice here to bargain for this. So Delta has fewer line holder guarantee hours per month for its flight attendants. So it gives them maximum flexibility to underpay you compared to the competition and overwork you compared to the competition. So that this is sort of a pattern. There's no one there to bargain for you guys. This is what happens. Fewer line guarantee hours, unlimited maximum hours. That serves the company's interest. It doesn't serve your interests for pay or for lifestyle. Next slide, please. Same thing for reserves. You can just look at the average in the industry. This is not cherry picking. This is what it looks like for reserves. Around 75 to 78 hours a month, with United at the high end. Delta's at about 2/3 of that. 45 hours a month reserve minimum guarantee. Again, favors the company. The company's on the hook for less time paid compared to bargained contractual reserve monthly guarantee hours. There's a pattern here. It's not hard to see. Next slide. When you look at, and this is somewhat confusing because of the terminology, but there are sort of two different functions for minimum guarantee during a day or duty period. One is the one-off time you would get paid as a minimum for hours worked for a day of showing up, a day of duty, right? American and United both have 4 hours, 5 hours minimum. Delta has 4.75, which has been rounded up here in this slide to 4.8. Alaska and Southwest have somewhat less, 3.6 and 3.5. But again, it's a snapshot of that particular day, what the minimums are. Other contracts, almost universally, if you go to the next slide, have something additional, which is an average guarantee, which is an average minimum across a trip. So the previous slide showed that Delta is willing to commit that if you show up for work for one day, you'll get a minimum guarantee of that 4.75. What other carriers have is an even higher guarantee or the same guarantee for an average across all of their flying in a trip, which would be divided up into 2 or 3 or 4 duty days. And so this is part of what I see again is the back of the book, that the average daily guarantee time is absent from the handbook, and other carriers reference and bargain for average daily guarantee time. And you'll notice Alaska moved from, I think, 3.5 to 4.43. Southwest moved up as well. So the average guarantee per trip day is generally higher than the snapshot minimum guarantee per day. Again, a pattern that exists in the Delta handbook that doesn't exist in contracts that I see across the industry.
And I'll just offer, Dan, that what this also does is this encourages the airline to schedule in a way that is efficient for flight attendants, not just efficient for the airline. So this may not turn into money, but what it does is it forces the company to schedule in a way that is going to make efficient use of our time.
Right. Yep. And that's what these daily guarantees generally, and trip rigs and those other sorts of things are generally made so that when the company's running its scheduling software, it minimizes the payout, but it also maximizes the efficiency of employees on the job, so that you're sitting less and the trips are more productive for flight attendants as well as for the company. Next slide, please. Another example, just taking a snapshot of how many days reserves are guaranteed off per month, contractually, legally guaranteed. Southwest has 14, Alaska 13, American United 12, Endeavor 12. Which carrier is low compared to the rest? Delta, the one in the red, 10 days off, reserve guarantee. Again, reserve days off a month. It's not the biggest deal, but in respect of reserves that are backing up the sort of chaotic system that has evolved after COVID, this is important to give people on reserve time off. And you'll see that Delta has had 2 days less than the minimum of even Endeavor.
Yeah. And we'll just, I'm just going to jump in here too, because of course, we don't call it reserve at Delta, it's called A days. But those A days have been going up, haven't they? Because of exactly what Dan's talking about. There's this low minimum. And so you're going to see more and more of your time accountable to the company, whether they're scheduling you or not. You are held accountable to the company, and other airlines are not. We bargain for that time off, and time is money. You can decide to do something else with that time. You can have a second job, or you're paying one less day of childcare, or you're able to take care of a parent, or you're not getting someone else paying for an at-home nurse, or whatever that is. Time is money. And this is exactly, I just want to be very clear. It's not like we don't understand that you have A days and not reserve. It's called something very different. It works differently, but the effect is the same, that more time, your time is given to the company without a return compensation for that. And you are the lowest in the industry because you don't have a contract.
And I think, Sarah, that's a good point. And you'll see it in the actual data. We get back from the government statistics about how many block hours time on the aircraft that Delta flight attendants have on average compared to other carriers. And all of these things added together means Delta flight attendants work more on average than other carriers, which benefits the company, which is why it's better for them not to have a flight attendant contract and better for you to have one, because there's lots of what we'd call hidden costs by not having all of these pieces and parts to your contract that other carriers have. It all adds up to more hours worked for Delta flight attendants, less time off for Delta flight attendants, and fewer guarantees in terms of your pay, and less efficient scheduling. So there's a lot of things that are tough to grasp all at once or even individually, but they all add up to definitely Delta flight attendants working more hours than other flight attendant groups. I think we've already gone over this one. So international override pay, once again, to the degree that Delta's block time for flight attendants was between, I think, comparatively 40 to 50% of all block time pre-COVID. This is a really important stipend for flight attendants who are flying international on top of your base rates. And you can see American and United have $3 and $2 per override hour for international flying. Delta's management has decided this is a good number for you, whereas American and United have collectively bargained over those numbers in their negotiation. So Again, when you look at Lodo premium pay, looking at a wider array of carriers because there's a wider array that pay for language premium pay. Hawaiian at $3, United at $2.50. Look where Delta is, again, reflective of the bargaining nature of these rates. They came as a result of flight attendants' voices who had language skills inserting their interests into the contract. And again, you don't have that, so it's no surprise that Delta pays less than other carriers do in language premium pay. Next slide, please. So one of the areas that I think, we have been made aware of in, say, the last 20 years is that insurance benefits are more expensive across the board, but especially at Delta, insurance benefits appear to me to be more expensive, less beneficial, and aren't secured by contract provisions. By that, I just don't mean health insurance. I mean life insurance and other types of insurance that other carriers who bargain for their benefits have more of those benefits than Delta provides to its flight attendants because you don't bargain for them. So I think the next slide is fairly apparent as to what I'm talking about. I'm looking at, in terms of this chart, the four largest carriers, American, Delta, United, and Southwest, and you'll see a wide variety of provisions that are provided in insurance packages, from health insurance covering medical, dental, and vision, basic life insurance, accidental death and dismemberment insurance, short-term disability, and long-term disability. Now, all those things come up and are referenced or framed in language in most large carrier flight attendant contracts. And we'll just go through a few of these examples, but I want to note that if you look at Delta, Delta has no's under every one of them except basic life, with a yes in your handbook as to what Delta provides you with from the benefits perspective in terms of insurance coverage. Now, American has insurance coverage medical. Yes, they guaranteed in their contract. United, yes, guaranteed in their contract and guaranteed at 80% premium paid by the company. Again, that is much stronger than having no contractual benefit. That's not saying Delta doesn't provide it, but there's no contractual obligation to provide or pay it or have any kind of limit, as we'll see in the next slide, about how much flight attendants are going to have to contribute to their healthcare coverage. Going over to, say, basic life, you'll see that stripe. Delta does offer that in terms of its handbook, but American, United, and Southwest all have 100% of that paid by their company in the contract, contractually binding, which isn't contractually binding in the handbook because it's not a contract. You go to accidental death and dismemberment, both American and United have it. You go to STD, they're offered in the contract at American, and LTD is offered both in the contract and at United. United has their company paying 60% of that cost. So again, when you look at why there are a whole bunch of red no's compared to a lot of yeses and company-sponsored programs, it's because flight attendants have had a voice at their table to decide that these things are important to put in the contract and have available for flight attendants who are on this job for their career. Delta doesn't do that.
Dan, let me just offer a little more perspective on this chart as well. So
Sure.
if you look at the medical box with the 80% premium, what we also have in the United contract is that costs can only go up by 7% each year, which actually means that at this point we are only covering 93% of the cost because there has been that cap every year.
Right.
I think people are very aware that health insurance continues to rise at an extreme rate, mostly because there are so many fewer union contracts and there's so much less bargaining power with the healthcare industries for these companies. Here's an example of where having a union on the property would actually help Delta to get better rates with these healthcare companies. And so that's one example. Another example here is that by having the union, if you look over at that STD line, the short-term disability for United, no, it's not in the contract, but because we have a union on the property, we were actually able to negotiate with the company to bring in supplemental insurance that's provided through the union. You can sign up through the company. We have access to that with the company. We negotiate that part with the company, but the union is able to bring in an insurance company that provides supplemental insurance. So if you see, for example, short-term disabilities, yes, at the flight attendant's expense under the American contract, we've effectively done the same thing because the union is there on the property and brings in additional benefits to the flight attendants through the union.
Right, right. And the next slide, I want to focus on something I think is very important. This slide essentially talks about what Sarah was mentioning, which is kind of the exposure that flight attendants have to healthcare premium increases. That everyone gets those tables. I think your next round of healthcare bidding is in November, and it'll show you essentially how many dollars you need to pay into a family plan or an individual plan, a gold plan, a bronze plan. What it doesn't show is how much your company is contributing. And one of the things that you'll notice with American and United is that they've got explicit language that I've noted down here in the footnotes, probably too small to read, but effectively, whatever the cost to the company is of healthcare, aside from the escalator restrictions that Sarah just mentioned, the maximum amount that a flight attendant is going to pay in premiums is 21% at American and 20% at United of the total premium costs that Delta pays, right? In most flight attendant bargaining, Delta is referenced somewhere north of that, more than 20 to 21%. It's not publicly available, so I can't state it here, but I know that Delta likely pays or forces you to pay a larger percent than United or American does for your healthcare costs. The amount of money that American and United pays is capped at these percentages, and it's a really important thing that Delta can essentially raise your pay, but then also raise your share of premiums for your healthcare at the same time, so that you're getting a benefit in wages, but some of it or all of it is getting taken away by increases in healthcare premium costs. And you face sort of an unlimited share up to 100%, I would imagine, of premium costs. And during COVID, you saw this. Most recently, your company has decided that what was fair to comply or force compliance with the mandates for vaccines was not to force a mandate, but to essentially jack employees' pay rates up by $200 a month. That couldn't happen at United or American because of these restrictions. The company can't force premium pay increases because in the contract it says the maximum amount we're going to pay is 21% of your costs or 20% of your costs. So I think this has relevance to today's situation with the pandemic, but I think it's one area where Delta flight attendants may like to look in terms of protecting flight attendants from escalating healthcare premium costs that don't occur at United, American, or other carriers. Next slide, please. So there is a wealth of information in the U.S. Department of Transportation that an economist such as myself can look at to compare and contrast a whole number of things for employees or for companies in terms of finances or operations. And I just wanted to go through sort of the result of what we saw in the contractual provisions in terms of real world cost data and information. And I just want to state that this is 2019 data. I don't think 2020 data is a fair kind of comparator because of all of the crazy pandemic and PSP payments that occurred. We'll get to that in the next section, but essentially what I tried to do is look back at a clean section of time in a year just prior to the pandemic, which is reflective of the things we saw in the previous chart or charts that show that you're not competitive in terms of overall cost, overall pay, and what Delta pays flight attendants or how hard you work for that money. So the next section is actual real world results from the 2019 DOT database. So if you take the $1.5 billion that Delta pays in flight attendant salaries, and you divide it into the 20,000 some odd flight attendants that are listed in the DOT databases for 2019, you come out with the average Delta flight attendant salary, including bonuses, was $61.5 thousand. Hawaiian, $76,000, the highest in salary. American at $69,000, United at $66,000, Southwest at $56.8. So this is all of the salary and all of the monetary rewards that Delta pays flight attendants in 2019 divided by the number of flight attendants. So this is a rough average. It's not saying anybody gets paid this amount, it's saying the averages. But you'll see, surprisingly, Delta ranks fourth, despite the fact that they tout these highline pay rates. And it reflects on what Sarah said, is it's kind of hidden in the lower pay rates, that the lower pay rates at Delta don't compete with the lower pay rates at, say, United or American or even Hawaiian. So in terms of salary, you bring home less bacon than the average flight attendant at Hawaiian, American, and United, and just slightly more than Southwest. Next slide. And I think this is very important, and it's a measure of your bargaining power within the company, in that this is simply taking a look at the salaries that the company pays flight attendants versus what it pays all employees. So your share of that entire salary pool is only 13.8% of all the salaries that Delta pays its employees. Hawaiian is around 20%, but you'll see that most carriers, including United, American, even Spirit, Alaska, are in the 16, 17, 18th percentile, which means that flight attendants take a bigger portion of the total salaries paid at other carriers than at Delta. The only place where flight attendants take less as a portion of all salaries is at Allegiant, and I think that's changing as time goes on, because Allegiant is recently organized under TWU. But this speaks volumes to me about the reasons why Delta benefits from having its flight attendants not organized. They pay less of their salary pool to the flight attendants than other carriers. Next slide, please. When you look at the flight attendants' share of not just salaries, all of the other things, including taxes, per diem, 401k matches, benefits, costs, if you throw those all together and you measure them against all of the benefits and salary costs that Delta pays and other carriers pay to all their employees, the flight attendant share is still less than what most organized carriers get as a flight attendant group in terms of their share of all the stuff, all of the payroll, benefits, per diem, 401k payments, and taxes that the company pays to all employee groups. You'll see that American, Hawaiian, even JetBlue pre-contract in 2019, their flight attendants get a bigger share of all the expenses the company pays to all of its employees at pretty much every carrier, except for Allegiant.
And Dan, I just want to, on these last two slides, we're also talking about including profit sharing. So right. This includes profit sharing. And this is also a comparison of all employee groups. So don't just be thinking about the ones that are typically organized at other carriers, right. But this also includes the salaried and management employees who often don't have a union.
Right, exactly. This is everybody. Next slide, please. So there is a way in the DOT database to estimate the annual block hours per flight attendant. And when you look at the carriers who are organized, most carriers fly in and around the high 400s to low 500 hours on average per block per year in terms of actual on the aircraft while it's moving from the gate to the blocks at the end of the trip. So that's what's called block hours in the industry. And it doesn't include the D40 time because you're not moving. It doesn't include any of your other payments for vacation or for sick leave. But essentially, this shows you how much on average is estimated for flight attendants to work during a given year. And this, again, comes out of Form 41 data. Some carriers don't provide enough information to calculate this, but I think we've got enough information here to show that Delta is second only to JetBlue in the amount of time that the average flight attendant works at Delta in terms of producing block hours, which is above all the other unionized contracts. And this again reflects JetBlue prior to TWU negotiating for their first contract. So
which they don't have yet.
Which they don't have yet, and they will get hopefully in the next period of time. But again, it reflects all of the things that don't protect you in terms of the company using you more per month and flying you more than carriers that have contracts, which again suits the company, doesn't necessarily suit a flight attendant. It means more time away, more time flying, more time in the fuselage than on average other carriers who have unionized contracts provide their companies. So not surprising again to this.
And Dan, let's put this into context with a very famous group that worked to organize this year at Amazon. Jennifer Bates, who was a worker in the Amazon warehouse in Bessemer, Alabama, testified before Congress. She said, we work to live. We don't live to work.
Right.
And that is the point here. That has been the point of organizing from the beginning of time, that companies don't get to control our lives. We take back control. So it should be our choice. If we want to work more, that should be our choice. That shouldn't be something that's forced on us. And they certainly shouldn't be getting that time for free.
Right. And this, again, it's not the direct reflection of one single thing in your handbook. It's a reflection of all the things, including the things we just went through in terms of differences, in terms of days off, you have to work more, in terms of maximum schedule time, you have to work more. Those things are reflected, not surprisingly, in the data that's reported by your company to the Department of Transportation. So it all sort of fits a pattern in my mind of what the company's allowed to do that perhaps isn't in Delta flight attendants' interests, and you don't have a voice to correct it right now. The next slide, there's two more data slides like this I wanted to show you. The industry looks at employee labor costs on a unit basis, and it's just a fancy way to measure how much each flight attendant costs per degree of output, and the output here is ASMs, available seat miles. Delta produces billions of available seat miles per year, and if you divide in all of the flight attendant costs into those units, the standard measure is how much does each flight attendant cost per seat mile during the entire year. You'll see the red bar it's kind of a weird number, but it's 0.87% of a cent. That is, every seat mile that Delta flies, the flight attendants cost less than a penny overall to fly that seat mile, which seems like a small amount, but again, there's billions and billions of seat miles out there. So this is kind of reflective of what mechanics costs, what gate agents cost in terms of cost per ASM. It's measured in cents. If you look at United, American, and Southwest, those flight attendants' costs are higher per seat mile because, again, it's reflective of not just this pay rate, but the expenses and all the other things that flight attendants have bargained for at each of those carriers. But one of the things that I try to do, and it's an industry standard adjustment, is that the systems that produce these ASMs are so different. Southwest flies short haul domestic, American, United, and Delta fly long haul international. So in order to equate that, there's a way to sort of right size the entire industry around a standard trip length and the standard seat capacity, so that you're not comparing, 11 or 12 flight attendants on a 777 going to Paris with Southwest flying a 737 with 3 or 4 flight attendants going from Delta to Albuquerque, or from Dallas to Albuquerque. So the way to do that is in the next chart, which is a standard, again, industry adjustment. I don't want to get too technical, but the term for it is CESM, cost per equivalent seat mile. It tries to erase the impact that longer haul and smaller or larger airplanes have. And you'll still see, even after this adjustment, that both American and United that fly a very similar type of wide body international domestic system that Delta does, kind of about the same size, their flight attendants cost more in terms of ASMs than Delta's. And that's the part of it that it's great for Delta to have lower cost flight attendants, but it's bad for you to have flight attendants who bargain for their wages and work rules essentially cost their companies more. This is the playing field that I think is sort of unfair, that Delta flight attendants, if they were able to bargain, would have a higher cost per ASM output because you'd be able to bargain for things that protect your work life, make more of a balance out of the work life relationship. And again, it's reflective that the salary piece that they tout doesn't in fact not come close to covering the other parts of the contract that American United have in terms of benefits to the flight attendants. So a cost to the company sometimes means a benefit to the flight attendants if it's more costly for the flight attendants at, say, American and United to operate than compared to Delta or anybody else. So this, again, is reflective of the inadequacy of bonuses and salaries to cover up the costs that are lost because you don't have work rules and guarantees that other carriers have in their contractually bargained provisions. Next slide, please. So this is just, again, it's hard to sort of pick from a wealth of information that we could pull from the handbook and compare it to contractual provisions. But one thing that flight attendants bargain for at other carriers is obviously time away. It's great to make a lot of money, but if you don't have time to enjoy it, again, it's that work-life balance that Sarah mentioned. Delta flight attendants, on average, have fewer hours away from work on vacation. You're granted fewer hours, and you have a different system, both in terms of this vacation accrual as well as sick leave accrual. That's different than other carriers that have bargained for their time away. The dotted red line here is contrasted in terms of total vacation hours, which is the pay per day times the days off that you get at each step of your career at Delta. And you'll see at the bottom, it starts at 1 and goes up to 27 plus. And you'll see all the other carriers, including Southwest, American United, and Alaska in different colors. And Delta is generally below the other carriers after, say, step 9, kind of in the middle of the accrued hours, beaten essentially by, I think, American and Alaska, as well as Southwest. But you'll see generally the dotted red line is below that accrued hours, accrued time away that other carriers are providing their flight attendants as a result of vacation time. Hours away from the job have been bargained. So it's, again, a reflection of the lack of a voice that Delta only provides you as much as they think you need. Payroll support program, I'll go through this really quickly. Everybody knows about this PSP program that enabled carriers to operate and pay their employees. Sarah was instrumental in getting this, amazing benefit to the airline industry and everybody in it to protect us workers from the onslaughts that companies without this sort of support system would have taken against their employee groups in terms of furloughs and different types of cutbacks that would have occurred had we not had the government through the payroll support program providing COVID relief. So one of the things I wanted to talk about, and I work with Sarah and the AFA and some others at Southwest, as well as some flight attendants at American, is to look at how many hours or how much payroll and reductions the flight attendants would take in order to offset the impact of COVID, ignoring the fact that PSP programs were paying these companies across the board a stipend or an amount to cover pay and benefits. American had several programs like United and Southwest that paid for employees to take time off, to not show up for work, to not be there when they didn't need them. It was surprising to me that Delta had so many flight attendants and so many employees take leave without pay, which essentially was allowing Delta to take the PSP money and not have to pay it out as heavily as United and American and Southwest, because United, American, and Southwest essentially bargained for employees to take leaves with partial pay. And that was eating up part of the payment that American, United, and Southwest were getting, whereas Delta, essentially, someone that was taking leave without pay was not getting any of the money that Delta was getting to cover those employees' jobs. And this is just a reflection of how much money you saved. The reduction at American in 2021 over 2019 was around 28%. And that's just in terms of the gross expense of flight attendants costed American in 2021 versus what happened in 2019 during the first couple of quarters that we've got in terms of DOT data. Delta was leading the league in a bad way, saving the most money, 40%. In a good way, it helped your company get through COVID. But again, you'll see that carriers that negotiated those sort of leave programs with their company ended up cutting expenses by between 28 and 31%. Delta, again, stands out as saving more, and it's because a much higher percentage of your flight attendants took time off without pay. No surprise, it saved more by not getting paid. Next slide. When you look at the combination of these three programs that Sarah and AFA were instrumental in getting for the entire industry, not just flight attendants, pilots, mechanics, ramp workers, even off-site meal preparers. There were three programs attached to laws and extensions of the PSP program. And I just took a look at the Department of Treasury website, which has publicly available data about how much it paid out in terms of total PSP funds. And it's pretty staggering. You've got American with the highest amount, $12.8 billion. Delta with the second highest, $11.9 billion. The government gave Delta to cover your expenses and other employees' expenses during that time. United at around 11 billion and Southwest at about 7 billion. And the amount of money that each carrier got was based on the things that Sarah and AFA negotiated back in early 2020 to make sure that whatever expense that carriers had to continue paying their flight attendants, their pilots, their mechanics, all employees would be covered by the government. And you'll see that Delta is $12 million. When you look at how much Delta spent, billion. Sorry, 12 billion.
It's hard to comprehend. We have a typo there that it says it's in millions, but it was billions.
Look, it's millions. It's 11,000 million. So
okay.
that's 11 billion, but it's 11,000 million. 900.
Right, there you go.
If you go to the next slide, you'll see that of the amount of money Delta took in, that almost 12 billion, they actually spent less on labor than they took in. I'm sure the company would have a quarrel with the way this is put together, but there's no doubt in my mind that looking at what they got from the PSP funds and looking at what's available from Department of Transportation labor costs, Delta made out better under those programs than any other carrier, with American essentially having spent $2.2 billion more than they took in from PSP, United having spent $1.4 billion more, and Southwest having spent almost $3.5 billion more than they took in from the funds that were shown on the previous page, whereas Delta spent about $400 million less than the PSP funds that were reported from the Department of Treasury. Since the last quarter that's included in the PSP is done, it was ended September 30th, about 25 days ago. I don't have information on the third quarter, but I've estimated to be the equivalent of the second quarter, which is kind of fair because that's the way it looked throughout history. Second and third quarter are about the same in terms of labor expense, but this is a fair representation of the lay of the land after COVID, that Delta made out better in terms of what it spent versus what it took in. And it's because it didn't have to pay flight attendants or pilots or mechanics in the way that unionized workers at other carriers bargained for pay for time off, and that you took it for free. Most of the people that were essentially taking leaves took it for free, whereas other carriers took it with 25, 30, 50% payments. And that's reflected in this data. And I think that's the last slide that I have.
And Dan, let's just stay on that slide for just a second,
Sure.
Because I want to remind people that the slides that you saw earlier are reflective of this. So you took more unpaid leaves. You took more early outs. You all talked about that. How did Delta avoid furloughs? Because you made it possible, not because Delta made it possible. The American and United and Southwest contracts held the company accountable to the provisions that were in those contracts. And the PSP program made sure that flight attendants would not take concessions during this time. The last slide, Dan was talking about the amount of concessions that we would have had to take on our backs if we had not had this program. So where did Delta get that additional money that they didn't have to spend on employee costs? It was the deep cuts that you made and the sacrifices that you made. And then it was also in places where they didn't have contracts with other employee groups, like the ground employees, the CSR, the passenger service agents, the ramp service agents, the management people whose hours they cut. Remember, they cut people from 40 hours to 30 hours unilaterally, and the other carriers couldn't do that. So you took deeper cuts in the flight attendant ranks. They refused to offer you a minimum guarantee. There were flight attendants who got paid less than other flight attendants at other carriers, but because AFA had because you had your organizing campaign there, it was much harder for them to cut your hours because you were holding them accountable. But the other employee groups that didn't have active organizing campaigns, they cut their hours by 25% from 40 to 30 hours. And so that's why they were able to walk away with more. Now, who did they give that to? They did a catch-up payment for management. They didn't do it for anyone else. And they have said that they can't give you an increase. This shows they can right here. And if you had a contract, they'd have to be giving you those increases right now, just like there are increases in each one of these other contracts right now. So okay, Dan, I didn't want to cut you off. Did you have a closing statement on this?
No, I think, to try and answer the question is, what is it costing Delta flight attendants not to have a voice representing the mass of Delta flight attendants who are unrepresented in this industry where 95% of the flight attendants are organized, I think has been captured in these slides to the best of my abilities. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason why Delta presents the shiny pennies to you as bonuses and salaries, and don't talk much about your exposure to healthcare benefits or the unlimited maximum monthly schedules or the minimum guarantees that aren't there, the days off. It's because they don't want to talk about the things that makes it worth their while to pay you more, but take more than other flight attendants who are organized would give them. And so this, I'd imagine, has been the argument with Delta for a long time, is we need to keep organizations off the property that would represent the flight attendants' interests because it saves them money. And it's time for you to stop giving a very profitable, I think Delta reported $1.2 billion in profits, higher than American, higher than United, higher than Southwest in the first quarter. Your company's healthy, your company's robust, and it can definitely afford to have flight attendants voicing their own interests in a collectively bargained contract, just like everybody else in the industry.
Yes. So let's talk about that PSP, because there were some particular provisions in it that make your organizing absolutely urgent right now, over the next 11 months, over the next 10 and a half months. So what PSP required was that all that money would go to paying frontline workers' pay. Okay. It said that we couldn't reduce the hourly pay rate. That meant that Delta couldn't come after you for cuts to your hourly pay rate. But it also did a couple of other really important things. It banned stock buybacks until September of next year. Okay. And we also, I just want to, and a year after that, it caps executive compensation at 2019 levels. So for the next 10 and a half months, there are no stock buybacks that can go to Wall Street. And for the next 22 and a half months, executive pay is capped at 2019 levels. That can't continue to rise. So when you talk about, traditionally at Delta, they've talked about a pie, and why, maybe some have suggested from management ranks, I would say, that pilots don't want flight attendants to organize or other employee groups to organize because they'd have to be arguing over that piece of pie. Well, let me be really clear. That pie is nothing compared to the pies that Wall Street takes from Delta and other airlines. And so for the next 10 and a half months, you don't have to compete with Wall Street. Wall Street cannot take the profits that you were helping create at Delta. And that is why it is urgent, more than ever, that you form your flight attendant union and that you start your bargaining in an atmosphere where you are not competing with unlimited amounts of pay for executives, with unlimited amounts of stocks and stock buybacks and dividends to go to Wall Street. Because more and more, Wall Street is able to take more and more from these businesses. And even if you think that your management is fantastic at Delta, I promise you that when I was in the room with them and the other airlines negotiating the payroll support program before we went to Congress together, we were the only industry to get this, the benefit of a union, of unions at the airline industry, and unions leading the way on the solution that was worker focused, was that we got something that no other industry got. And that's why Delta is able to announce these incredible profits this year. The PSP program was still going on during that time. So think about that. Okay. We made that possible with our efforts, our energy, our political clout, because we stand together as workers and we have a voice, not only at our airlines, but in our entire economy and in our political process. And so what Delta said in that room, they were the only airline that said this. One of the demands was simply, and they tried to say this differently to all of you at the time, but one of the demands was simply to follow the law under the Railway Labor Act and not interfere with your free right to choose union representation. And they were willing to give up that $12 billion that you saw on the screen if we said that they had to simply follow the law that already exists under the Railway Labor Act and not spend one penny on anti-union organizing. Think about that. They were willing to tell Wall Street, you don't get any money. They were fine with the no stock buybacks. They were willing to even cap their own pay. They would not agree to simply not spend any money on trying to tell you that you shouldn't have a voice at work. That was a deal breaker for them. And they were willing to give up that $12 billion. They were willing to give up the support that they needed in the middle of the biggest crisis that aviation has ever faced. And so they were not willing to give up the ability for you to have a say in the process at Delta, for you to have a contract, for you to have a collective bargaining relationship, for you to be able to have a say at Delta about how your safety and your work rules and your work life is going to work at Delta. And so whether you like Delta management now or not, what I can tell you is Delta management is about to lose control. Wall Street is going to take control in 10 and a half months. And we're going to have a harder time bargaining for the value that you create at Delta. You need to join arms with the pilots and fight back. And so this is not at crosshairs with the pilots. This is not in competition with the pilots. We need to stand with the pilots against Wall Street, keep those profits at Delta, and get it in the hands of the people who are actually making those profits possible. Delta management's not even going to be able to do that, but with your union, you can do it. So the urgency in signing a card right now, and let me be very clear, there are organizers who are on this call right now who have been working very hard to get a union at Delta who forgot to keep their current card on file. Okay, why have we not gotten to a union election? It's because we have not had enough people sign cards within a year to get it there. Now is the time. You can see what Delta is trying to do to take and take and take from you and not offer any certainty in your future. And in 10 and a half months, there's going to be even more uncertainty for you and more power in the hands of Wall Street to take more from you. So we got to get this done right now so that we can lock in the profits that you helped create. There is no more urgent time. Spread the word everywhere. We got to get this union election filed by the latest next June. Go get it done. Go ahead, Tiffany.
Thank you, Dan and Sarah. That was a lot of information for 1 hour. And we want to be respectful of everyone's time. So we're going to take a few questions. And if your question doesn't get answered on the call today, we will get them answered on the website. The first question is from an anonymous flight attendant who asks, Delta says the EIG gives us a direct relationship with leadership that having a union would take away. What examples can you share where union reps have the same, if not better, direct relationships with their leaders?
I'll give you a great example. Right after we negotiated the last contract with United Airlines, we beat that $100 million out of United. When I called shortly after that, because we wanted to do a relief mission to Puerto Rico, and I asked the CEO to give us an airplane to help do that. He responded within less than 24 hours, and we had a 777 that we were allowed to take with union members to take a relief trip to Puerto Rico and help support the island and get them the relief that they needed, with 300 union members who were nurses and truck drivers and doctors and electricians who helped get the island back on its feet. That's a great example, because if you were an individual flight attendant with a big heart, and you went to management and asked them to do that, would you have the kind of power to have them respond to you? And so that's an example of who we are as flight attendants and how we like to behave. But think about that in terms of any safety issue that's at work. The EIG can make suggestions to management, but management under a legal a relationship with you as with a union and a legal representation stance at Delta, they have to respond to you. And they don't get to just tell you no, they have to meet with you. And if it doesn't meet your needs or if it breaks the contract, then we have a way to enforce that. And so that is the difference. And the EIG is simply there to make suggestions, but it's completely in the control of Delta to say yes or no, or to change it the next day if they want to.
Right. I would second that, Sarah. And I would say that I've seen when there's been a transformation of the relationship between an at-will employee group like Delta flight attendants trying to voice their interest through a program. I saw this at JetBlue. When you're a business partner and you've got a contract with that person, it's a different relationship because there's leverage there. You're a business partner. You're not just an employee who wants something that may or may not be in the interest of the carrier. You already have a relationship through your contract and representation. And the second thing I'll say is, if having EIGs and other types of employee relations programs suited the workers better than contracts, you would see a lot of contracts being voted out by their employees, because contracts have a value, not just to the union leaders, not just to the alphabet soup of unions that are out there representing employees, but to the employees themselves, to get action through their unions to be sort of impactful. And it's a much better relationship, I think, given the right characters on both sides of the equation, than it is to have a sort of company created discussion group. And again, I don't see carriers union saying, this doesn't work for me, let's go back to ununionized, non-organized discussions. It's not in their interest, it's proven that way.
And Dan, finally, what I would say is that Delta never would have gotten those $12 billion if it wasn't for the unions at the other airlines, because in Congress, if they sent the EIG there, it would be like another voice coming from the company, as opposed to workers standing on their own with their own voice that is recognized by Congress as their own voice. And because we went together, company and unions together, that's how we got it done. So you don't have the kind of standing anywhere else unless you have your union.
And ask the pilots, ask ALPA if they think that having pilot EIG would be better than, the pilots themselves, not ALPA. Would that be a better way to get what they want and to have a more forceful way to discuss things with the company that benefits the pilots? They'd say no. That they want the union there to give them leverage, to have respect, and to be a vehicle for the pilots.
Great, thank you. Our next question comes from Sarah. When Delta changed the pay schedule to only getting paid every 2 weeks for what you worked versus a monthly payout on the 1st and the 15th, are Delta flight attendants the only ones no longer receiving a monthly guarantee?
Yes, great. Next question.
The next question, also from an anonymous flight attendant. Delta recently came out saying we are still the highest paid total compensation, including profit sharing, etc. This seems a strongly false statement, especially given the airline industry's current state.
100%. You saw it in Dan's analysis, and he showed it in several different ways. Delta flight attendants are not earning as much as flight attendants at other carriers that are direct comparators.
Yeah, the data doesn't lie about that. I mean, I've been doing this for almost 40 years, and Delta can go out and say that. And when they talk about it, they can cherry pick things and talk about salaries and bonuses in a particular time. But again, even if it were the same, it's not guaranteed. But it's not, because what they're paying for is for you to fly more block time, have less protections, et cetera, that results in flight attendants costing less on a unit basis than comparators with union contracts. And so I don't know how many ways to pull the levers to say what Delta is saying isn't true.
Well, what we will say is that Dan took the data from the government, from the data that Delta submitted to the government, where they can't lie. So Dan built the models that you saw today off of what Delta themselves submitted to the government. And
I took it out of the handbook and AFA and other carriers' contracts. So it's all kind of there in the public. Delta can have a PR campaign to tell you folks that you're making more and the bonuses make up for it, but it doesn't hold water when you actually look at the data. Not surprising.
I mean, I think it's obvious. It really couldn't be clearer. No matter what the top rate pay says, we're losing money as Delta flight attendants every day that we don't have a contract. And Wall Street's coming for us next. The time is now for Delta flight attendants to build our union and join AFA, but it's going to take all of us. So please make sure your cards are signed and updated, wear your AFA pin proudly, and get involved with our campaign. It's going to take all of us, and we'll bring that campaign across the finish line. Be sure to visit our website at www.deltaafa.org for links on how to get involved. Check your email, get a hold of your base activist. Anybody can help you get involved. And we can do this. We are Delta flight attendants. We're the best in the industry and we deserve the best contract. So let's get it done.
Tiffany, I want to thank you and all of your flying partners for keeping the campaign alive, for making it possible for us to have PSP events in states where we didn't necessarily have a lot of AFA members. You helped to make it possible to do all of this, but that was through our union, through AFA. And now what we're seeing is a resurgence in activity in this campaign. I see the momentum coming. You can get this done. So you've been hearing this for a long time, but what we've described here right now in this moment in time and the urgency around doing this while some of these PSP protections are still in place is right now. So thanks to all the activists who kept this alive, but all of you who are just tuning in, this is your union and it's yours to build and it's your moment to take control of your future. Thank you so much to everybody and solidarity forever.